Hi, this is Minilogue XD, and Korg did something here which may prove to be one of the most interesting things a synth manufacturer can do, which is to open up its digital oscillator and effects engine to any developer that cares to create plugins for it without going through Korg for approval or certification. This is something we've seen smaller manufacturers do, like open source based platforms such as the Organelle, but for a mass market brand like Korg to adopt this strategy, I think, is not only super cool, but will also pay off for them and their users longer term. Let's start with an overview of the panel. XD has a 3-octave slim key keyboard, not quite full size, but also not mini keys. They're velocity sensitive, but don't have aftertouch. The XD is pretty much knob per function for the analog elements, but it does require different degrees of menu diving to control the digital oscillator and some other advanced modulation parameters. The XD has a built-in sequencer, though it only has 16 steps, but it does have 4 motion sequencing or automation lanes. The XD has a joystick, which is a combination pitch bend and modulation control, and you can assign it 2 different parameters based on whether you move it up or down. The XD can store 500 presets, or programs as they're called here, of its entire settings, all the knob positions, parameter settings, and sequencer information. So once you've created your masterpiece, it's easy to store and recall it later. You also have 16 slots to store your favorite presets for quick access by pressing Shift and clicking any one of the buttons here. So it does have what any synth should have, which is a quick Blade Runner preset. On the back, it's got MIDI in and out, though no MIDI through. It's got analog sync in and out for clock, as well as analog CV in, a pair of analog inputs, which can be used as a CV gate pair or as 2 separate CV inputs. This means that you can use modular or semi-modular gear like the no-coast here to modulate any one of almost 30 parameters across Minilogue XD. You can also plug in a damper pedal. In terms of audio, it has 2 mono outputs or a stereo headphone jack, and though the oscillator section isn't stereo, the effects are. Now, next up is going to be a beginner-friendly overview of the voices, oscillators, filter, envelopes, and LFO. If you're familiar with those terms from the Minilogue or other synths and want to skip ahead to the digital multi-engine, custom plugins, effects, sequencer, and tips and tricks, feel free to skip ahead using the timeline on the left. So let's dive in. First and foremost, when you start a new preset or load an existing one, the knob positions won't reflect the position of the actual parameter they represent. You can always press Shift Play to load up the knob positions into the synth. So now the knob positions reflect how they actually impact the sound. Let's go back to the regular init preset. The XD has 4 voices. Now, each voice has a complete set of 3 oscillators, mixer, filter, and modulators or automatic knob turners. Of the 3 oscillators, 2 are analog, 1 is the digital multi-engine, and the 2 analog oscillators can be pitched separately either by octave or with a fine-tune control, 1 octave up and 1 octave down. So for example, a 4-octave range on each oscillator, and then fine-tune, pitch control. And if you hold Shift and press a note, you can also tune this up and down by semitones. Now, aside from the individual oscillator pitch control, you also have a global octave control for the keyboard. These are only 3 octaves, but you can go up 2 octaves and down 2 octaves using this switch. The analog oscillators have 3 core shapes: sawtooth, triangle, and square. And then each of these has its own shape modulation or control. Pulse width modulation for the square, and the triangle gets folded like this, and the sawtooth has this happen to it. course, this can be modulated. Now, to add slightly to the complexity, the XD has 3 voice modes. You get to these by twisting the voice mode depth knob or by flicking this switch. So the default is 4-voice polyphony, which means you can play 4-note chords. However, you can stack oscillators. If you turn this knob in poly mode, you'll get only 2 notes, but they'll be stacked on top of each other, so you won't hear 4 notes, but rather 2 notes at a time, but you can hear that stacked detune sound. You can control the detune, and if you want to stack 4 voices, you flick the switch to unison, and then all 4 will play together, 1 note at a time, and you can control the level of detune. Finally, the chord mode will take all 4 voices and play a chord with them. The default is mono, but you've got over a dozen chord shapes you can play with the 4 voices. The 4th option here is the arpeggiator, and you've got 2 modes, either momentary or latch mode, right? And there are a few arpeggiator types, including a chord mode, a few random modes, and of course there is a Stranger Things mode. You set the level for each of the 3 oscillators to analog 1 digital in the mixer section, right? So this is oscillator 1, and then I'll bring up oscillator 2, right? And we'll get to the multi-engine as well, with its various modes. Anyway, for now, back to the analog oscillators. They have 3 cross-modulation options. These cross-modulation options are all ways that oscillator 1 impacts oscillator 2, so you will only hear what they do on oscillator 2. I'll lower oscillator 1 down so we can hear just number 2. The first option is a cross-mod depth, which is basically an FM synthesis depth amount. Then you have oscillator sync, which forces oscillator 2 to reset every time oscillator 1 resets. And this causes that familiar hard sync sound. Now for this to work well, you need to make sure that the frequency of oscillator 2 is higher than the frequency of oscillator 1, right? So it'll work here or here, but less so or not at all if it's lower. Finally, there's a ring mod option. Right, that's either on or off. Obviously, it depends on the frequency of both oscillators. Right, but these are these harsh, metallic sounding, harmonically rich sounds. Okay, so those are the analog oscillators. Let's talk briefly about the multi-engine. The multi-engine has 3 core modes. There's a noise generator, an FM or VPM synth, and then the user plugins that you can onload on here using the companion software. All 3 modes have a type knob and a shape knob, and you can often access another parameter by holding shift and turning the shape knob. And then both for the user oscillators and the FM or VPM engine, you have 6 additional parameters available in the program edit menu. So let's go through these briefly. There are 4 types of noise: a high pass filtered noise, low pass filtered noise. This is a kind of variable Q band pass filter on the noise, and then you have a decimator, right? Lo-fi noise, and you can also enable key tracking for this with shift and the shape knob. The VPM or FM engine has a few core shapes, right? And each of these has both a shape option, right? A shift shape option, and as I mentioned, if you enter program edit mode and press this button, you have a few additional parameters. You can page through them using this button and then change a parameter using the value knob. Now, these parameters are pretty important, so I wouldn't recommend ignoring them. You can have different envelopes or LFOs here that impact the multi-engine based on what the plugin or internal engine lets you access. Now, in my view, these parameters are just as important as the knobs you have for the analog engine, so hopefully in a future version of the Minilogue or any of the log series, there will be additional knobs on the panel to control these parameters. So this leads us very nicely into the user engine or multi-engine section. Now, as I mentioned, I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of both the Minilogue XD and its bigger brother, the Prologue, these user plugins. I'll take a brief look at a few of these third-party plugins later on. Like I said, it's a whole world in here, and these two can be controlled either using the shape knob, right? Shift shape. And the additional parameters here in the menu. All right, let's move on to the filter. Minilogue XD has just one type of analog filter, a low-pass 12 dB per octave filter that starts filtering out the sound above the cutoff frequency at a rate of 12 dB per octave. As expected, the filter has a variable resonance that amplifies the frequencies at the cutoff point. Right, so this is without resonance, with a bit of resonance, a bit more, and it will self-oscillate if you turn it up all the way. And it's a pretty raspy filter. Like I said, it self-oscillates, so if I turn down the oscillator, you'll just hear its tone. And you can key track it, either 50% or 100%. And the filter also has two drive positions. So let's get our oscillator back in here. This is what it sounds like at 50%. Right? And 100%. Again, 0. 50 and 100. So this will drive and distort and add harmonics to your sound. I wish, by the way, this wasn't a switch, but rather a continuous knob, so it would be more playable. Okay, let's talk about the modulation section, meaning the robot in Minilogue that turns knobs for us so we don't have to. Now, modulation always has a source and a destination. So take, for example, the filter cutoff knob, right? We can move this manually in this sort of motion, or use the LFO, which is a repetitive knob mover, to do it for us. So for that, we want to point the LFO to the filter cutoff. We want to set it to a triangle waveform, which means that it will go back and forth in that triangle-like shape. And then all we need to do is tell it how fast to turn the knob. And it can do it at audio rates. And the intensity of the knob motion. Now, like I said, and I'll turn down the noise, this has a few shapes, right? So triangle is sort of like a human style knob motion. There's also a ramp down and a pulse width back and forth motion. And the intensity can be inverted. Now this is most noticeable with this downward sawtooth shape. If I hold shift and turn the knob, right? Then the sawtooth will ramp up instead of going down. Now, like I said, the LFO is a modulation source, and you can point it in one of three directions. Filter cutoff was the first, but we can also modulate the shape of the oscillators, right? It's impacting oscillator 1 here, but if I bring up oscillator 2 and the multi-engine, it will also impact them unless you change that in the settings. And then you also have pitch control, again impacting all three oscillators unless you change the settings in the program edit menu. Finally, for the LFO, it can be either at a free rate, as determined by the rate knob, or tempo synced, right? In which case, you'll get subdivisions of the tempo of the Minilogue, or just one shot, which means it'll run once, and and then stop. Right, if I lower the rate, you'll hear that better. Essentially turning the LFO into an envelope, which is a good segue into the envelope section. So aside from the LFO in one-shot mode, the Minilogue XD has two envelope generators, or one-time modulation generators. Both are triggered when you hit a key. The simple envelope generator has an attack and decay stage. Attack is the initial motion up or down, depending on polarity, and decay is the motion back down or up, again, depending on the polarity. The middle position is no modulation. Then if you turn this clockwise, you get a positive modulation, and counterclockwise, you get a negative modulation. So let's demonstrate this using the filter, right? Put up some resonance, right? So a positive attack would move the knob like this, and then decay would move it back. Let's make it happen here, right? I increase the intensity, turn up the attack. I get a positive modulation up. Attack is time, right? So the more I turn this clockwise, the longer the attack motion, the shorter it is, the snappier the attack motion. And then decay is the speed of the motion back, right? So slow decay. And the filter will take its time going down. A fast decay, it'll be increasingly snappier. Right? So attack moves it up, decay moves it down, as long as the polarity is positive. If I turn the polarity counterclockwise, then the filter cutoff will move in the opposite direction. First down and then up. Now, like the LFO, this too has three destinations. Filter cutoff, the pitch of all three oscillators, and then the pitch of oscillator 2, which is an interesting choice. We'll get to this later on in the tips and tricks section. The last envelope is the traditional ADSR or amp envelope generator. Sustain gives you control of the level of the note when you hold the key, right? And then attack, decay, and release are, again, elements of time, or how long it takes something to happen. So attack is the time it takes the sound to reach its peak. Decay is the time it takes the sound to get from the peak to the sustain level. And then release is how long it takes the sound to die down when you leave a note. So with that, you're basically caught up on how synths work. Let's move on to the effects section. The XD has 3 effects slots: mod, reverb, and delay. These are chained one after the other. You can have any of them either on or off as you choose, and you can also load up multiple third-party user plugins and use one at a time in each of the 3 slots. The user plugins, by the way, don't necessarily need to be modulation, reverb, or delay effects. They can pretty much do anything they want. As I mentioned before, this really opens up the XD. I'll show you a few examples of this later on. Now, each of the effects has either 2 or 3 controls by holding shift and depth. So for example, if I move to the reverb and turn it on, right, I can choose the reverb time and depth. And then if I hold shift and depth, I can also change the mix. Right? This is just the reverb. This is just the dry signal. And this is the mix. Now, each effect has a few effect types, right? So this is one type of reverb, but there are quite a few others which are really nice. Right, go through these quickly. Space. This is sort of like a shimmer effect. Then submarine is the opposite of shimmer. It goes down instead of up. Horror sort of modulates the reverb. And back to hall. Similarly, there are a few delays. Right, I can turn this on or off. Set the time. Feedback. And there are a few delay types: mono, ping pong, There are also BPM synced versions of these. Right? Sync to the tempo. And if I keep flicking on these, I've got a few user effects here, more on these later. Finally, the modulation effects. The built-in ones are ensemble, phaser, flanger, and of course a few user ones, a chorus. And if you want to select which user plugin you use, you have to use Shift and Select, and that lets you flick through those. Again, I'll demo these later. Let's move on to the sequencer. The XD has a 16-step polyphonic sequencer with 4 parameter sequence or motion sequencing lanes. Polyphonic means that you can record between 0 to 4 notes per step. Just hit record, and then I can, let's say, do this. And I've recorded a polyphonic sequence. Right. And like I said, I can layer 4 lanes of automation on this. So if I enter motion mode, and let's say I want to automate the filter cutoff, I just hit record and start moving the knob. You can see it's knob motion recorded here. Right, pretty straightforward. If I wanted to, I could automate another parameter, let's say resonance, hit record. And it doesn't matter where I hit record, the minute I start moving a knob, it will record a full cycle, and I can record up to 4 of these. Now you can also edit this on a step-by-step basis. So let's say I wanted to edit the filter cutoff at a few of the points. Right, I could just go and do that on a step-by-step basis. So I could mute any of the steps I wanted. Right. Pretty nice. And if I hit record, I can see which notes are in each step. And I could, of course, change them if I wanted to, right? So I could change this to the step to this if I liked. Now the sequencer doesn't have ratchets, but you can sort of experiment with that with, say, the delay function. And you can also modulate delay time in one of the motion sequencing lanes. So if I hit record, just mess around with this. So this is as good an opportunity as any to look at the menu system. There is a edit mode which lets you choose one of the main menus, and each of these menus has different sub options which blink on the steps here, right? So these different options are for the program edit menu, and if I hit sequence edit, then these are the options that I could change per sequence, right? This, for example, lets me delete any of the automations. If I wanted to delete the modulation of delay time, I could do that here. And this page lets me temporarily turn modulations on or off. So there go my modulations. I can also turn them back on, and this smooths the motion of the modulation. Anyway, so these are the options in the sequence editor, and then you have a few global functions that you can change the settings of the XD overall, not per preset. So for example, these are a few of the things that you can change on a global level. There's a metronome and so on. And if you see these dots here on the bottom, it means that there are a few options per submenu, right? So master tuning has 2 options. And this menu, global 2, has metronome control and 5 options, right? And this one has 4 options and so on. So quite a few options that obviously require a bit of menu diving. Some noteworthy options are user scales that you can build in here. And of course, there's a full list of these in the manual. On the program side, you can determine, for example, what the joystick does, right? So by default, Y+, moving this up, controls LFO intensity, and Y- controls the cutoff, and you can change that to any one of a number of parameters. I think there are, like I said, close to 30 of these. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if you have any sort of modular or semi-modular gear, you can also use the CV inputs in the back to control parameters. There's a CV gate mode, which I mentioned before, but the more interesting one is modulation mode, which lets you choose any one of the two inputs, right? CV1 and CV2, and then assign those to any one of a number of parameters with various intensity and polarity. It takes a few knob turns here, and you've got two of these, as I mentioned. Okay, so just for fun, let's talk about a few patching ideas and tricks. I'll start with an init preset. Idea number one is how to get a rhythmic sound without using the sequencer, so that then you can use the sequencer as an overlay on top of that. We'll use the LFO for that in sawtooth mode, and it can be either normal or BPM, and I'm going to point it to the filter. Choose the starting point a bit lower here, then just choose an intensity, and now I have a rhythmic motion, right, where I can determine the rate of this rhythmic motion. It's skipping here, by the way, because it's tied to the tempo in BPM mode, but I can just have complete fluid control of the rate. And now I've got sort of like a mini sequence within a sequence that I can then build upon in a bigger sequence. Little trick or idea number two is that you can point two modulation sources to the same destination. So for example, here I'll take the simple envelope generator and use that to have an additional motion in the filter like this, right? So again, just set the polarity, let's say to positive, start at a lower point, choose my attack and decay times to taste. Now this is triggered, remember, once when I hit the keys, right? So choose a different, right? Both intensity and rate. Right, and different starting point if I like. And I have that double motion, two sources impacting one destination. Couldn't hurt to add a bit of reverb. Again, all this is without a sequencer running. So a really nice thing that you can use to build on. Now let's say that I wanted to add a pad running in the background here. I'll use the multi-oscillator in, say, sine mode for that. But you notice that the filter is filtering out the multi-oscillator as well, so it's not really a pad in the background. And that's where in the program menu, under the other category, other settings, is one of the most important functions, I think, in here, which is the ability to route the multi-engine routing post the filter, post the VCF. The result is that the filter no longer cuts out whatever the multi-engine produces. Right, so I can have this ongoing pad going behind the rhythmic modulation motion. Now that's cool, I hear you say, but I also hear you tell me that I just lost the ability to filter the multi-engine oscillator, which leads me to the fourth concept I want to present to you, and that is that you can and should treat the shape controls of the complex digital oscillators in the multi-engine as the opposite of filters. So when you start turning the shape knob, harmonics will be added, right, to the sine wave, just like the opposite of using a filter. Which brings me to tip or idea number 5, and I also mentioned this before, you really want to learn the program edit functions of the multi-engine because there are always treasures inside there. One of them is another attack decay envelope beside the simple envelope, at least in the case of the VPM multi-engine in here. Other user engines may have other modulation options. So remember, what I'm going for is I want this to happen automatically. Right? So I'll go through the parameters here, and indeed there is a shape mod intensity. I'll bring that up. Now it's not doing anything because I didn't set attack and decay times. Right, and then I can go back and set an intensity for the modulation. Right? I'll shut these down just for a second so you can hear it. Right, so now we have an attack decay envelope controlling the shape of the multi-oscillator, and this is happening completely independently of these envelopes. So essentially, we've created a sort of bi-timbral preset here with two different sounds doing two different things. Okay, let's move on, and I'll go back to the init preset. Now I promised I'd get back to why this pitch 2 function in the simple envelope generator is interesting. Pitch 2 controls oscillator number 2, so I'll bring that up, and if I give this any intensity and any attack decay settings, what you'll hear is pretty odd, right? This is our oscillator number 1, and this is oscillator number 2. So, not worth much. But if I lower VCO1 and turn hard sync on, then its pitch is forced to stick to oscillator 1, but it makes that hard sync sound. Of course, you can change the intensity to make it more subtle if you want. And the relative octaves will change its character as well. Another interesting use for pitch 2, if I turn hard sync off, is to turn oscillator 2 into a kick. Right? And you do that with no attack, a short decay, maybe a different shape. Right? Larger intensity. Then we turn down sustain, put decay here. And you can imagine how sequenced, and then maybe with an LFO to noise, you can make this into a little beat. And finally, a last little neat trick that I wanted to show you is to run the sequencer just as a modulator without programming in notes. And for this, I'll go into this preset. Does it nicely? Right? So this has notes sequenced in, but I could just go ahead and delete all these notes. Right? So now the sequence theoretically isn't doing anything, but it still has its motion sequencing plugged in, and I could, right, listen to all those modulations as I play different chords. And I can also run the arpeggiator on this, right? So the motion sequencing is running, the arpeggiator is running. I could change chords and sort of create patterns that are longer than 16 steps using this technique. Another way of looking at this is that you have 4 additional LFOs that are tempo synced and that can control way more parameters than the onboard LFO can. So that's it for this little tips and tricks section. If you want more of these tricks, there's a whole book of them on my Patreon. Let's move on. Before I talk about pros and cons, I wanted to go through a few third-party plugins, which, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, to me is one of the most promising things for the future and longevity of the Minilogue XD. There are a few open source ones, like this, the implementation of mutable instruments plats. So this, for example, I think is the additive synthesis module of plats, right, which lets you add and remove different harmonics, right, and this too has a shift function for shape, right, so you can use both of these together, and again, remember always to go into program edit and look for additional parameters for the plugin. Some of them have only a few slots filled in, but certainly worth a look. Now, I'll link to all of these in the description, by the way. There are a few interesting paid plugins. There's Blinds, which is sort of like a pulse width modulation for multiple waveforms that it has, and it also lets you morph between various shapes in an interesting way, sort of like opening blinds in the middle of a waveform, transitioning from one to the other, in this case, a simple saw to a square. And it has a few other shapes and morphing techniques in it. A company called Sine Vibes makes 3 different digital engines. Bent is an FM-based engine. Turbo is a wave shaper. engine, and there are a few nice sounds in it. And then they have an engine called Tube, which is based on resonator modeling. And there are a few nice presets in here. Finally, a company called Dirtbox, or Dirtbox Synths, also makes interesting oscillator modules, but they also make effects plugins, both in the modulation and in the delay category. Now, these are pretty interesting. So, as I mentioned before, the XD only has a low-pass filter, right? But if I go into the mod section and then select the user plugins and then hold Shift and select, I can choose a few of their plugins. This is a resonating bandpass filter, right? And there are two controls for it, resonance and cutoff frequency. And there are a few other interesting ones. One of my favorites is the panner, right? Stereo panner, and you can choose the depth and the rate. Should be hearing this in stereo. And then another nice one is their tremolo. Again, you've got time and depth controls. And this, of course, impacts anything going on in the synth before it. Let's bring this back up. Aside from this, they also have a few custom delay effects, right? So these are right after the regular delays in the list. Okay, so this one, for example. Right, a few interesting ones. Now, unfortunately, you can't control the mix with these. Korg doesn't open up the shift knob to developers, at least not yet. Maybe they will in the future. Let's go through these. Right, sig delay is nice. So pretty cool stuff, a few user delay and modulation effects, and hopefully we'll see more of these in the future. A request to the developer community from me, can someone please develop a freeze/granular effect in the modulation delay slot so that we can use it alongside the reverb? I'd be happy to link to that in the description if anyone makes that. Okay, so let's talk about pros and cons. On the hardware side, I guess anyone can have their most wanted features, and that would probably make for a both bigger and more expensive XD. But that said, there are a few features on other synths that aren't here and may be important to you, like MIDI through, a 64-step sequencer instead of just 16, aftertouch on the keyboard, and a drive knob instead of a switch, because the drive here is really excellent. I mentioned all of these things before. There's also no external audio input, which would have been fantastic considering the excellent filter and effects section, but again, it is what it is, that's the hardware. On the firmware side, there are a few features I wish they'd add, like the ability to easily transpose a sequence, and I'm sure other people have their own requests, but most importantly, I think, is the third-party plugins system. It has two flaws currently. The first is that if a plugin crashes, it freezes the entire synth and you need to reboot it. Now, like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I think it's good that Korg opened up the platform, and I don't expect them to take responsibility for bugs in third-party plugins. But if a plugin crashes, it should impact just that preset, not the entire synth. At the very least, there should be a way to reset the synth without going through a full power cycle, which takes time due to the tuning. The second issue with the plugins is that if you use a user plugin in a preset, the association that preset has is to the plugin slot number, 1 through 16, not the individual plugin ID. So if you want to store or share a preset, the plugin it's using needs to be in the exact same slot every time. If you rearrange your plugins and don't put them back in the same slot, you'll be using a different plugin or just pointing to an empty slot in the preset that you saved. Now I say all this currently because I asked Korg about these two issues and they're aware of them and are exploring ways to solve them, so hopefully they will be addressed in the future. Final thing on the hardware side that obviously can't be changed but hopefully will be addressed in future versions of the Minilogue is give us more access to the multi-engine parameters. There are 6 of these per plugin, and I think they should be equal citizens to the analog oscillators. Now, all that said, it's very hard to beat the value you get from the XD compared to how much it costs. The XD may seem small, but there's a cognitive dissonance when you first use it because its sound is huge. There are a few alternatives at a similar price range like the DeepMind 6 and maybe a used Analog 4 Mark I, which have their advantages, but to me one of the most exciting things about the XD is of course the support for user plugins, both on the oscillator and the effects side. I mean, the XD is pretty great as it is now, but with some creative development from third parties, there's no telling what this synth will be able to do a year or 2 from now. So that's it for the XD. As I mentioned before, if you want to learn more about synthesis and enjoyed the tips I showed you before, there's plenty more where they came from in my book available to people who support this channel on Patreon. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comment section below. Hit like if this was useful and make sure to ring the bell after you subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.